think we can start. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Julia, Cristina. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Carla Sir, and along with Professors Jimena Rodriguez and Kip Tobin, we started Inclusive Gatherings about a year ago. And this is an EPIC grant project that was inspired by one of the EPIC seminars called Inclusive Classrooms. Nice to see you here. He was one of the teachers for that seminar. And the main objective for this project was to create an open space for faculty to learn about issues of inclusivity, and also to talk and learn about the best pedagogical practices. So we've had 3 events so far. The first one was called Hot Moments in the Classroom, given by Emma Nabilov, who is the director of the Intergroup Relations program here at UCLA. And the second one was called Politics and Inclusivity by Vice Chancellor Jerry Kang. And the previous one was a panel on classroom design and inclusivity, which was moderated by Adrian Lavigne here, who is faculty director for CAT. And all these events and sessions were partially recorded, so they are now available on our website for everyone who was not able to attend. And the website is inclusivegutherings.ucla.edu. Yeah. And now I'm gonna let my colleague Kip Tobin introduce our special guest for the night, Frank Tuitt.
So Dr. Frank Tuitt received his doctorate from Harvard Graduate School of Education and a BA in Human Relations from Connecticut College. Up until last year, he was the senior advisor to the Chancellor and Provost on Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Denver, and Associate Professor of Higher Education in the Morgridge College of Education. He is currently on sabbatical this year, although he did spend several months in the Netherlands advising universities on diversity, equity, and inclusion. His research interests explore topics such as access and equity in higher education, teaching and learning in racially diverse college classrooms, and diversity and organizational transformation. He was awarded the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education Individual Leadership Award this year for outstanding contributions to research, administration, practice, advocacy, and policy. He is the co-editor and contributing author of several books. I will just mention 2: Race and Higher Education, Rethinking Pedagogy in Diverse College Classrooms, Contesting the Myth of a Post-Racial Era, The Continued Significance of Race in U.S. Education, and many more. So it is a pleasure and honor to have Dr. Tuitt with us here today. Please join me in welcoming him.
All creatures in the room are excited to be here. It's a warm welcome. Thank you for the introduction and for being great hosts. It is a pleasure to be back here. I feel like I make it here at least a couple times a year to see family and friends and former colleagues, current colleagues, and former students, now professors, and the list of connections to UCLA goes on and on. So it is a pleasure to be here. If this was a classroom, my classroom, we would spend some time getting to know each other. I would spend some time talking to you about my background and why I teach and what makes the work I do really close and dear to me, why I'm passionate about creating inclusive learning environments for myself and my students. Sometimes we think about inclusive pedagogy or creating inclusive learning environments as something just for the students. But it has allowed me to create the kind of space where I can enter full and hold and bring all parts of me to the environment. We don't have enough time for that today. So I will try to give you little bits of information about me as it relates to how I think about implementing inclusive pedagogy in the spaces that I occupy. And I will try to learn a little bit from you as we talk. I was saying earlier today, every time I have an opportunity to meet with a group of folks around teaching and learning, I learn something new. So the first thing I'll do is reject the myth that I'm an expert about this. I have spent some time thinking about it, writing about it, putting it into practice, but I haven't figured it out completely. And in fact, I've been spending more and more time telling folks to think about the concept of grace and how we give ourselves grace in doing this work. Because I'm someone who thinks about this a lot, and I make mistakes in this work. And so for some of us who are just starting to think about it, it can be a tough journey. So even those of us who think about it on a regular basis can always learn how to do it better and better. So I'm going to do something real quick. I'm going to ask you to find somebody in the room that you don't know, introduce yourself, and just say one thing that you hope to get out of the session today. I'm going to ask you to do that quickly. So go now. Find someone you don't know.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So, thank you for doing that. Typically in my class before, we would have engaged in this kind of way. We would have talked a little bit about ground rules and norms and our expectations for the learning environment. We would have also talked about how a part of, at least for me and how I think about it, creating inclusive learning environments absolutely requires the utilization of engagement. And often I used to think about that in terms of voice. And I'll start with an example. Getting ready to teach the first class of critical race theory in education, and the student is sitting with two, what turns out to be interpreters. And my narrative for that day is based on using voice. And I'm looking out and I'm saying, I can't use the narrative that I've prepared for today because this student is depending on others to communicate for her. And so in the midst of getting ready to start the class, I was like, how am I going to do this? And made a shift from wherever I had voice, I talked about engagement. And then engagement can look in a variety of different ways. Right? And I made it through the class, but what I had to do was go back and adjust. Change the syllabus, change some of the activities I had planned, right? And so it requires that we are flexible in how we think about constructing a learning environment, and that we are prepared to adapt in the moment, right? Which is not something that if you're teaching the same course over and over and over, it becomes sort of routine, and we engage in what I refer to as auto-teaching syndrome, where we just show up and do it the way we've always done it. The student is now in grad school thinking about how we can create inclusive learning environments for hearing impaired students, right? Based on their experience in that class. So, yeah, expect the unexpected. So I'm curious, what are some of the things that, as you introduced yourself, you shared related to wanting to get out of the session today? Just take a few ideas, expectations. Anybody? Yes.
Sorry. I would like, because of the role that I'm in, to be able to carry on the work of teaching faculty and engaging faculty in creating classrooms, and I think about how that looks a little bit different depending on the discipline.
Yeah. Tell everyone your name and your role since you mentioned it.
Yes. Adrienne Levine, faculty in mechanical and aerospace engineering and associate vice provost for the Center for the Advancement of Mechanics.
Someone else, thank you. Anyone?
I was going to break the ice.
We're taking time to warm up. Jessica.
So my name is Jessica Harris. I'm a faculty member in the Graduate School of Education, soon to be a different name, we don't know, but we're adding a major, which means it will no longer just be graduate students. So I would love to know more about this giving grace to ourselves. I would say that I've been teaching now for probably 6 or 7 years, but my first year I have a little bit of PTSD still, and probably am anticipating too much of the unexpected, that it might inhibit my teaching. So, yeah.
Thank you. Couple more. Yes.
Yeah, I'm a stranger here. Everybody, hello. My name is Maxim. I'm a Fulbright scholar from Moscow, from Russia. I'm doing my scholarship in Indianapolis University School of Education, and I'm here occasionally. My friendly fellow invited me to attend, so I'm glad to see you and be here. In Moscow, I teach graduate students about differentiation and differentiated instruction in classroom, and in Russia, when we talk about inclusive education at all, we mean that people with something connected with health, yeah, and social issues are not included in this question. So after spending 4 months in the U.S., I observed lots of classes in IUPUI School of Education, and I'm really into this theme, so I would like to listen to your perspective and your experience in this. And actually, my question is, what does it mean, like 2.0? What is the difference 2.0
Yeah.
from 1.0?
Good question.
In your angle.
Good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Lori Mattinson from Writing Programs. I see we're well represented. We have lots of our faculty here. I just want to say it's such a relief to come to a space on this campus and not have an agenda. I'm just totally open to what's going to happen here, and I love doing things with people outside of our department as well. So I realize how often I do walk into a space here with a specific agenda, and for good too. It's a curricular or pedagogical agenda, right? But here I just feel like I can just be open to what happens.
All right.
What you've got to offer.
Cool. So thank you all for sharing both in a large group and in the smaller pairs and triads. So a couple of my goals really is to talk only for a short amount of time about some of the theory and philosophy behind creating inclusive learning environments. And then really to get you to engage in some activities that will hopefully connect who you are as an individual with how you show up in the classroom, and the ways in which how you show up impact the pedagogical choices you make. So that's the journey I'm trying to take us on today. And so there'll be a couple of different activities. I tend to reject the notion that I could walk into a room, give you 10 steps to creating an inclusive classroom, leave, and know that you will be able to do it. So for those of you who came looking for that, I apologize. I will tell you or share some strategies. I will collect some strategies. Context is one of the things that I'm paying attention to, and every institution has its own set of norms and its ethos that shapes how we show up in the classroom and the choices that we make. So I'm going to rely on you for your expertise on that, what it means to be a student, an instructor, an administrator here. And then and this sort of gets to part of the answer to your question. In 2003, I finished up at Harvard Graduate School of Education, and the title of my dissertation was Black Souls in the Ivory Tower, Understanding What It Means to Teach in a Manner That Respects and Cares for the Souls of African American Graduate Students. And I was interested in the pedagogical practices and the learning conditions that created optimal learning environments for, in this specific case, African American graduate students. And when I came out of that experience was an understanding that centering in the way that I did, a focus on African American graduate students, gave me some insight into what were some of the challenges in a learning environment and how addressing those challenges would benefit all students, regardless of their background. And so that led to the creation of the Race in Higher Education book and the Realizing a More Inclusive Pedagogy, which was the first of my writing on inclusive pedagogy. And I had, up until recently, thought that this was one of the first efforts to think outside of the K-12 context, where typically we talk about inclusive learning environments, around the concept of inclusive pedagogy, and learned recently that there was a scholar in the UK who had been thinking about this in the mid-60s to late 60s. So I want to go back and do a little bit more digging around what was some of the forces happening there at that time that led to this. Some would argue that my focus on race in higher education was a product of me wanting to do me search. I would argue that yes, I was interested in learning more about my own experience in graduate classrooms. I'm going to put Yanina on the spot here and ask her if she remembers a conversation as I was exploring. Yanina Montero is one of my longest mentors from way back. And I was exploring dissertation topics, and I told her that I wanted to study something around racial and ethnic themed housing. And she looked at me and said, well, that's an interesting topic, but I don't think they're going to be around for long. So you might want to think about something else. And at the time, I was in an environment where there was a lot of sort of discussion about who the Harvard Graduate School of Education was designed for and how students who were not a part of that group were experiencing the environment. And so that led me to focus in on a classroom. And I came to appreciate that the classroom is the heart of what higher ed institutions are about. Right? And that if we can figure out how to create inclusive classrooms, then we've have a better chance of creating inclusive institutions. Right? Historically, we tend to direct our services outside of the classroom and to leave untouched what happens within these walls. So inclusive pedagogy, and I'll go through how I thought about it at that time, got me thinking about creating best learning conditions for graduate education. I then began to think about it across the educational spectrum, but with a particular emphasis on college classes more broadly. And a couple of years ago, I had the privilege of working with two of my former graduate students on the race, equity, and the learning environment, the global relevance of critical and inclusive pedagogies. And if you were to look, and I don't do it here, but if you were to look at the two side by side, you begin to see how my own thinking around some of these issues evolved over time. And I'll get into a little bit. What's interesting to note here is that I start with an emphasis on race. It gets extended in the critical and inclusive pedagogy, but race is still central. And then some of us in the room I know are familiar with an organization called POD, or POD Network. It's an organization for faculty developers in higher ed, and they have a journal that's called To Improve the Academy. And I had a chance to work on another project, and where I specifically focus, because of this context, on how to make Black Lives Matter in traditionally white institutions, right? In traditionally white classrooms specifically. And so, in some strange way, I've come full circle from where I started and where I'm now more recently moving. So everything that I'll talk about in the next 10 minutes, and it will be really quick, sort of capture my thinking, and you'll get to see a little bit about how the first thinking has evolved since 2003. So, inclusive pedagogy. I'll just go through this quickly here. The purposeful embodiment of inclusive pedagogical practices towards multiple identity groups. So essentially what I'm saying is that the classroom like this is filled with people who enter the space bringing with them rich, diverse experiences that matter. And historically, we've tended to think about the classroom as a space where you're supposed to check that at the door, and we're all supposed to be the same. And so it was easy to, let's just say easy, it was easier to think about instruction in a way where you didn't have to account for the diversity that would be in the room. And what we knew experientially and now has been well documented is that the classroom is not a level playing field, that because of the society we live in, it can create privilege for some and facilitate disadvantage for others. And our goal is to create an equitable learning conditions so that everyone has the chance to be the best that they can be. And we argue that in order to have a chance to do that, you have to focus on diversity. So diversity has to matter. Right? It is a focus not only on the mind, so the intellectual aspects, but the entire person, mind, body, and soul. It is the development and utilization of educational resources to enhance teaching and learning. I am so happy that, and I don't know if this is your experience, but I feel like more and more people are taking advantage of programs like this, Centers for Teaching and Learning, discipline-related specific opportunities to focus on teaching and learning. That hasn't always been the case. And we're getting to a place where we understand that teaching doesn't have to be something that we do behind closed doors, that we do in isolation. And that it's okay to ask for help. In some institutions, you're now seeing people who have full-time positions dedicated to helping instructors create inclusive learning environments. Right? So that's how far we've moved in this work. It requires that we recognize the cultural differences that diverse individuals bring to the learning environment. I would argue not just recognize, but engage and leverage in ways that enrich the overall teaching and learning experience. In order to sort of extract the benefits of diversity, we have to have a welcoming classroom environment. So paying attention to how our students are experiencing the learning environment, focus on what are the norms and expectations, focus on transparency, right? And then the biggest sort of criticism of inclusive pedagogy, at least when we first started introducing this, was that we were asking people to water down the teaching and learning environment. And now that I have a couple of former students in the classroom, I would say, at least in my classrooms, my students always talk about this being one of the most challenging spaces they've occupied, right? And so it's not about watering down what we're trying to do. It's setting the bar high and giving folks the resources and the support to be able to reach that. Right? It rejects this notion that some folks are just incapable of performing at a particular level, right? So it requires a shift in how we think about the learning environment. So these are some of the core sort of aspects of inclusive pedagogy. What we know from research now, and we have a significant body of it, is that when we're able to do this, we have a range of outcomes. Academic outcomes, diversity-related outcomes, and civic outcomes. So, in inclusive pedagogy, we focused on voice, we focused on teacher transparency, we focused on engaging the lived experiences, and you will see that some of these remain in our concept related to the 2.0 version. As we continue to study what different folks were doing related to inclusive pedagogy, we knew that everyone had a sort of approach to it. It wasn't that I was just going to show up and figure it out. It was that I was drawing upon some kind of framework, some kind of theory to inform how we were structuring the learning environment. So inclusive pedagogies, broadly defined, tend to have some kind of intentional approach to it. What's great now, in addition to there being more resources, is that disciplines have been doing the hard work to figure out what works for their specific discipline. So engage the humanities here broadly. At other institutions, you're seeing this work in STEM disciplines now more and more. So having an intentional practice. Voiced in a lived experience continues to be a part. It rejects the notion, even though I'm doing it right now, that I can come in and just tell you what to do and you can figure it out. That the more we are engaging in interactive, dynamic interactions in the classroom, the more optimal the learning is. Interdisciplinary and diverse content, and I will come back to this point a little later, but it's really thinking about two things I want to highlight here. I gave the example about my hearing impaired student and how I went back and changed the syllabus, and it allowed me to do that, so I recognized that that might not always be the case. Right? But even if I was teaching math, I would have had to make some adjustments in my approach to the structure, right, to accommodate this teacher, this student. So interdisciplinary and diverse content, and the fact that it's balanced in its portrayal of diverse groups. Right? So thinking about what you choose to include and why you're choosing to include it, where possible, thinking about and knowing who's in your classroom and looking for ways to connect what you're teaching about to their personal interests and experiences requires you asking about that. And I understand in larger classes it's much harder to do that. It also requires, where appropriate, um, including diverse perspectives and disciplines. Right? And so I'm fortunately in a field where education where I get to draw from a range of disciplines. But even in the field of education, there's an expectation that we're going to center educators who do this work. And my position on this is no one discipline is strong enough to answer all the great challenges of the day. So the first three were included to some extent in inclusive pedagogy, I'll say 1.0. Here's where we start to move a little bit. Even though my impetus for thinking about inclusive pedagogy was around race, when I went back and looked at my findings, somehow race had become less centered in it. Right? And it moved to, well, let's just think about best practices across the board. And so what became obvious to me as the more and more I thought about this is that, yes, we are thinking about how to create optimal learning environments for all students. But if we shift completely and think about just all students, we begin to miss the students who historically have been underserved, the students who, under the current national context, are at threat, right? So if we take a bland, neutral approach to the learning environment, we're going to miss opportunities to level the learning environment in ways that give everybody the chance to be the best that they can be. So it requires us thinking clearly about the activities we choose. It requires us moving to more focus on identity and understanding the impact of identity, and striving to create socially just learning environments. So what does that mean for me? At a real basic level, I don't ask students to do anything that I'm not prepared to do in the learning environment. I am not going to put a student at risk in the sake of learning for others. Right? So thinking about again, I keep saying this over and over, the pedagogical choices we make and why we're making them. And then last, second to last, courageous transparency. It means being willing to show up and to be explicit and transparent about who you are, why you're passionate about what you do, and why that matters for the learning that you expect your students to do. It means allowing students to be able to connect with you in authentic ways. It's easy to hide behind the podium and to just focus on the content. I know my students engage in a much more focused way when they have a sense of who I am. Right? And then we end the chapter on Inclusive Pedagogy 2.0, recognizing that this is not easy work to do. And not only is it not easy to do, that our institutions haven't caught up to these expectations. We're not rewarded for doing this. Some would argue it doesn't count. And one of my students makes the case that not only does it not count, you are penalized for doing it because it's not recognized. Right? So, yes, we have to change what happens in the classroom, but we have to also change the institutional structures and systems that support this. So this is a crash overview of inclusive pedagogy, broadly defined. One of my favorite activities is to ask folks to do just a brief free write. So I want you to answer this question. Are you what you teach? At least think about it. Are you what you teach? There isn't a right answer to this. And if you don't teach, are you what you do? Whatever it is you do professionally. So we're going to move into an activity in a second, and I want to set this activity up in this way. It's going to ask that you think about what aspects of your identity are most important to you. And I would ask you to do that right now, to generate a list of, say, 4, 5, 6 aspects of your identity that are important to you. However you want to interpret what identity is to you. Another way to think about it, what are the salient characteristics that you identify as important to you, to who you are? So another way to think about this, which is slightly different, is what aspect of your identity would your students, or if you're not a teacher, your colleagues, what would they say are important to you? So now you should have 2 lists. Raise your hand if your lists are exactly the same, the two lists. Okay. Anyone else? A couple? So I haven't sort of empirically tested this yet, but some might say that because your lists are the same, you show up in your fullness in that space. The reality is most often those lists tend to be separate. Right? And so there's already, what we're arguing here, a collision of how people understand who we are in relationship to each other, how we think of ourselves standing in front of the classroom, and how others see us. And my hunch here is the more we are able to show up, the more our students are able to build connections with us, and the more they're able to trust us in the learning process. Right? This is at the heart of transparency. Now, I'm not talking about transparency just for transparency's sake. There are boundaries and rules and things that need to be set. The way I think about this is what is important for your students to understand about you that supports your learning, your approach to learning, that supports your theory of learning. Right? All right. So you have two lists. Piece of paper went around. Everyone have one? Okay. Out of the two lists you've created, I want you to choose 5 aspects that are now important to you. You've been able to come up with your own and then think about how your peers or students may see you. Between those two lists, come up with 5, and let's begin to slice them up in the pie. All right? You're going to create a slice that's proportioned to how important that aspect of your identity is. So settle on 5 first, and then divide your circle up into 5 slices, each slice in proportion to how important you think that aspect of your identity is. Again, there are no right answers here. After you've completed your pie, I want you to choose the slice that's the most salient. In theory, that should be the largest, but that's in theory. Choose a slice that's most important, most salient. And then think about two or three ways in which that aspect of your identity informs how you think about how you show up in the classroom, how you think about teaching, or how you think about engaging in whatever that space is you occupy if you're not an instructor. So I'm going to model for you my pie. So I have spent all of my higher education experiences in historically white institutions. Many of them where I walk into a meeting, a class, a space, and I am typically one of a few African American males in those spaces. I like to say I've served time at Connecticut College. I spent 6 years at Wesleyan University. Followed my mentor to Princeton University for a year. I was at Harvard for 7 years. Spent an 8th year in a postdoc. Just finished my 15th year at the University of Denver. And also spent a year at New England College in Henniker, New Hampshire. All right. And what they all have in common is a desire to, a struggle with how to educate folks who look like me. And it's the motivation for why I became a faculty member. Actually, I didn't want to become a professor. I was going to follow my mentors and become a dean or a vice president. And my chair said, "You just wrote a 270-page dissertation on teaching. You should at least try it." So, best decision I ever made. Epistemological influences. I am nurtured, developed, grown out of critical theories and epistemologies, ranging from critical theory, critical race theory, decolonizing theories, feminist theories, and more recently, I've used that to shape my thinking around inclusive excellence and obviously inclusive pedagogy. I have went from being a student activist to a scholar activist. And actually these slices used to be together when I was just a faculty member. and then I went over to the dark side, and the administrative slice became its own monster. And I am identify as a black male of Caribbean descent, born in the UK, and raised in the Northeast, which used to be a major part of my pie. The longer I've been away, the less that's been a part of it. But being out of Northeast had a particular set of experiences. Growing up in the heart of busing, being escorted into South Boston High School to play a basketball game, and being escorted by the police to get us through crowds of folks who didn't want us there. So race has always been central for me. And how it informs my teaching is quite significant. I got to the University of Denver and realized that for many of my students, this was the first time they were interacting with someone who looked like me in person. Think about it. I've been through preschool, high school, 4 years of an undergraduate, maybe a couple of years of community college, a couple of years in a master's program, so for my PhD students. Never had the opportunity, the privilege, I would say, to be in a classroom with someone who looked like me. And so to assume that that wouldn't show up, that wouldn't matter, would have been a mistake on my part. And so I use transparency to at least attempt to demystify what this black man with a Harvard degree might be, so that they don't have to waste time thinking about that, and we can get to the heart of teaching and learning. And I do that through narratives. I do that through talking about why I teach and why I'm passionate about teaching what I teach. And I do that by engaging directly in terms of who they are. And so I don't try to hide it as if I could. I want to make sure that they know that my race is important to me. And it does inform how I teach and what I teach and why I teach. But it's not going to be a barrier to their learning. Right? And just by naming that, it provides a sense of relief, a sense of connection, a sense of engagement. So that's how it shows up for me. So that's my pie. I'm curious to hear what you all had in your pie, but before we get to it, I'm going to have you share your pie. I'm going to ask you, trust me, and just talk to someone you're sitting next to about what you put in your pie and why you put it there. Okay. Has everybody had a chance to share? Okay. So, who wants to share a slice that was in their pie? Anyway, I shared all of mine. Yes.
I'll share because I make my students do this a lot. If you've never done it in the classroom, you should try it someday. It can be really fun. And then, yes, I can talk about that sometimes. But I drew, so woman is a fairly large piece of my pie. I recently had a kid, so mom is in here too now, so it's taking up even more space than it does. I like to watch how these change for, like, in different contexts or different spaces. A lot of them stay the same. Whiteness has gotten bigger the more integrated I am into professional spaces and ask me to think about my own privilege and my whiteness. It's often, I often make it a very pointy, jagged piece because it intrudes into all of my other identities now in ways that I think are useful for me. But that if I had filled out one of these when I was growing up, I might have forgotten to make that very large piece of my identity. I had the privilege to not be thinking about that.
Thank you. So, some different choices here. So, parent or guardian. How many of you had parent or guardian in your slice, in your pie? Just raise your hand. And how many had it as their largest slice? Okay. How many of you had parent or guardian? And then for you, was it your largest slice? Okay. Okay. All right. How many had gender? And largest slice? Okay. And you mentioned race. How many of you had race? And largest slice? Okay. Cool. How many of you had profession? Anybody have it as their largest slice? Like to say, when you have to work on balance. What else? Couple more that were in your slice, in your pie. Age. How many of you had age? All right. Was that your largest slice? Okay. So when you think about your largest slice, what were some of the things you came up with in terms of how it informed the way you show up in the classroom? Inform how you think about teaching or the work you do, whatever that is. Yes?
So until you went through and asked what our largest slices were, I don't think I realized that. So I actually saw my different identities, my 5 different identities, as equally distributed. But then when you were asking that, I noticed that I had one identity educator and one as learner, and I realized that that's actually, in some ways, the same thing, right? And so the biggest realization that I have of that is the back and forth that you have with students. So the courses that I teach are very student-centered and trying to decenter myself as a voice of authority and acknowledge that I'm also learning with them, not just in the classroom, but even in the research that I might do. So I just thought that was a really interesting realization that I don't think I had put together.
And can I ask how you got to do that? Like what led you to want to do that?
To want to make that the primary focus.
That approach with your students.
Oh, that approach?
Yeah.
I just find that that's just more enriching for everyone involved.
Okay.
So I think, for me, I'm less interested in creating little mini-me's go on in the world, and rather teaching them skills where they can think more critically about the world around them. So I actually teach a lot of diversity centered, like the curriculum is about diversity, and so as you were mentioning earlier, it's not really, there's hot button issues, and so I'm not interested in forcing them to agree with one side or the other, but ask them to think, why do you believe what you believe, and not to just inherit those beliefs from our parents or our communities, but really think about why they stand where they stand. And so I feel like being able to demonstrate for them that I'm also learning and figuring that out and negotiating that, it maybe models for them that it's okay for them to do that too, and to think about that and know that it's an ongoing process.
So the reason I asked that question is here is a pedagogical strategy that's being employed that's connected to your identity, that has a sort of philosophy or approach to learning connected to it. So that's the connection I'm trying to get us to do, right? Is to be able to connect the dots in that way, right? And sometimes these things happen sort of unconsciously, right? But the more we're able to be explicit about it, the more intentionality we have around it, the more we're able to design our learning environments with that in mind. And so trying to get us from these sort of unconscious things we do to being conscious about them and being able to articulate why. What is the theory of learning connected to that? Thank you. Somebody else. Largest slice. Yes.
So I kind of combined a lot of identities, but for the most part, I put the largest slice as a woman of color, immigrant who prioritizes equity, and that shows up, through my work with EPIC, kind of our goal to prioritize inclusivity and teaching inclusively as a mainstay in pedagogical approaches to teaching rather than as an aside, as in like, oh, here's all of these other pedagogies, and then there's inclusive teaching, right? To really embed that in course design and even in designing assignments, right? No matter what subject you're teaching, whether it's a course that talks about race or gender, right, or other kinds of identities, or any other course. The other is the content in the things that I teach, and my research. I do race and representation in popular culture. I do a lot of kind of thinking about immigration and how that impacts, folks who migrate, who are stateless and things like that. And so that's really where I really, and then in mentoring students who are like me, and a lot of that work is I've done through the Academic Advancement Placement, AAP, which is a group here at UCLA that focuses on mentoring and supporting historically underrepresented students at UCLA. And I see myself in those students, having been just like them, coming into a college environment or a university environment with no maps whatsoever, because nobody before me has really told me about the college experience.
Okay. One more. Anyone? Yes.
My largest one was parents. So I think it's understanding my kids are now in their 20s, understanding my own imperfections as a parent, all the ways that I have failed. Even when I love them and try hard, it's made me more understanding. And I think it really helps me kind of, I teach students, I'm a language teacher, but I'm teaching international graduate students preparing to be TAs.
Okay.
So they are from various fields, and they are in a class preparing them to be teachers themselves.
Great.
And so in some respects you want to be a role model, but you also, I think, want to let them know that you're not perfect. You're not going to do everything right. Even, 30 years on, you still screw up. Right. And I think that helped me as a parent too. I could tell my kids, sorry, screwed up. I get it. I'll try and be better. And I think just having that sort of relaxed experience as a parent, kind of getting that has helped me even be a better teacher. Because I think it's important that we understand that we will sometimes not measure up to our own expectations, but it's okay.
I wish Dr. Harris was still here, because that is the grace part I was talking about, right? That there is an intentionality around what we're trying to do, but also realizing that we're not perfect, we're actually imperfect, and that we are going to make mistakes. And what's important about that, when we are aware that we make mistakes, is that we own it, that the transparency stays there. Sometimes, for me, it requires I go home, I pour myself a drink, I reflect, and then I begin the next class with it. I think I missed you all in this interaction somehow, right? And if I had the chance to do it over, this is how I might do it different. Or, I don't know how to do it differently, but I do know that I didn't get it right this time, right? And owning that. I saw a hand, yes?
My biggest slice was empathy, and it shows up in how I work, how I do work. And I work, I'm a disability management consultant at the university, and I work with employees, staff, faculty who need accommodations for either temporary or permanent disability. And I often have to facilitate conversations to teach. I'm going to go back to facilitate understanding across the table. When someone can do work and others believe they cannot, and help to break down those barriers. And having to bring a capacity where I'm equally patient with the person who doesn't believe an individual who has limitations can actually be positively contributing. I have to be in a place with patience and understanding willingness so that that other party stays open and also doesn't feel necessarily having to be defensive. And hopefully growing in a direction that is accepting of someone who has a disability.
Yeah. Thank you. So I was walking around looking at some of your artwork and noticed that some of you didn't follow the rules. And I'm curious about that. I peeked at Dr. Harris's bunch of circles. Right? And more I've been thinking about inclusive assessment. If I was grading you on what you did, and you didn't do it according to my requirements, in theory, I should mark you off for that. Right? But perhaps you created something even more amazing than I could have imagined. I always talk about my brother who now is a detective, but started out as a mechanical engineer and was in one of his early classes and was asked to come to the board. And he corrected the instructor by doing the problem a different way, by finding an answer to the problem a different way. The answer was right, but it wasn't done the way the instructor wanted him to do it. And my brother, who I applaud him, though my parents didn't feel it was the wise decision, said, to hell with this. I'm not going to be an engineer. If it means fitting into this box, doing it this way. Right? His name's Michael. We call him MacGyver because he can fix anything. Right? Right? But so I'm now moving into how do we think about inclusive frameworks that allow us to think differently about assessments. how we evaluate knowledge and learning? And do we have to be rigid in that, in the ways that historically we've been? Thank you all for trusting me on doing this. I need to move a little bit out. One last example. So I talked about my identity. These are some of the charts that I would see in my intermediate statistics class in graduate school. What do you notice about it? Unemployment rate by race, mean income by gender and race, incarceration rate, poverty rates. A lot of black failure. Right? And so I was having a psychological reaction to the choices my statistics teacher was making around what charts to engage the class with. Right? And I often wonder if I had just seen one slide that had my community in a positive light, how that might have shaped my experiences differently. Right? And so just another way in which identity can matter. Now, I'll be honest, I wouldn't have wanted her to address these issues. But to say, one, to notice the choices, and to say if you persisted and wanted to continue to use these data sets, to say, these are complex issues, and we can't begin to unpack them in this class. And I want to name that. Just that simple sentence would have said, okay. Are you raising your hand? Yes. No. Okay. Would have said to me, all right, at least the instructor recognizes that there's something here, and I'm not the only one who's sort of paralyzed by what I'm encountering. Right? So we have to think about the choices we make pedagogically. So students, staff, and faculty interact on campus with varying levels of identity salience. Just because I identify as a black man, I could have a twin here who has a very different understanding of what that means for him. Right? So we can't generalize across that. Identity matters as it relates to how individuals view their overall sense of belonging in our classrooms, on campus. It can be triggered by some event or encounter that is totally beyond our control, right? Which is why pies can change over time, right? It forces us to think about how we balance the needs of majority and underserved students in the classroom. Right? And it requires that we have, at least in our toolkit, some practices, some approaches for thinking about how to create inclusive excellence, how to create inclusive learning environments. How y'all doing? I know I'm throwing a lot at you. And we have just a little bit of time. So I'm going to get to this next activity. And then we'll spend some time having some conversations about this work. This is going to be another quick one. How many of you love group work as a student? Only a couple, huh? Not surprising. Does everybody have one? Take a few minutes to read this case, and then we'll process as a large group. what's the issue in this case? Or issues? What are the issues in this case as you see them? Anyone?
Shayla feels really uncomfortable being the only woman of color.
Shayla feels really uncomfortable being the only woman of color in her group.
And it's compounded by people not wanting to switch.
And there's this thing that happens where people are like, that sucks, but no, we are staying where we are, right? So we can get into why that might have been the case. What else?
I think that men from first group, they don't understand what the problem is and what are the reasons why Shayla doesn't want to be the only one.
Right. We're great. Why wouldn't you want to be in our group? Yes.
I found something interesting in the wording here, where it says, in addition, the white men in group 1 were offended that Shiloh wanted to switch to a different group because they didn't see what the problem was. Well, how many men were in group 1?
So
were the men of color in group 1 not offended?
There were no
Or
men of
were
color
there
in group.
Only white.
Only white men in group 1.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think there's also a general issue with like the leadership, right? So like how they handle the situation.
Say more.
So, I mean, I guess the if this were me, I think the first thing that I would do is not out Shayla for her request. I wouldn't have put her on the spot. I would have actually done some reorganization of the groups and said, I looked at the distribution of groups and based on expertise or based on your several knowledge base, I want to rearrange the groups slightly or something like that. I wouldn't have outed her to then put her in a situation to not only feel uncomfortable with the first part, but then after this really uncomfortable discussion to then be sort of rejected by her peers.
So a difficult situation gets even more difficult by the way it's. What else?
I think it also started with this sentence, without providing direction in terms of how to do so. The instructor thought it best to allow the process to happen organically and ask the students to form the groups themselves, and then Shayla doing the sign in for everyone or the sign up for everyone. So that shows that there maybe isn't the process isn't as transparent and intentional in assigning and configuring this assignment.
It made me think too of like this was a sort of multiple steps of Black leadership at that level. So the easiest way for the leader to sort of fail to think about the consequences would be to just like let them work with whoever they're sitting next to and call that organic. And that has still a whole bunch of potential problems, and Shayla may have been the only woman of color on her side of the classroom, still could have ended up in a bad group.
Right.
But to kind of, it was compounded, I think, by the decision to not even do that and assume that somehow they would form networks by the end of the class without like someone counting them off or signing them up, where all those things have potential problems. But yeah, but it was, I think, extra.
So let's say the instructor had a rationale for all of the choices. So in a democratic society, you don't always get to choose who you're going to work with. And so, or you don't get the luxury of having groups arrange for you. So let's allow the students to have some ownership of the group forming process. So there's a theory there that Shayla was asked, could the class help resolve this issue, and that there was a commitment to turning this into a teachable moment. It still went bad, right? Even with all the good rationale. Yes?
Also, there might be a problem in the in the relationships between the instructor and his TAs, because it said that one of the TAs received the sheet and assigned the 2 students who were absent. So was it his own will, or did they negotiate how to deal with that?
Yeah.
We don't know, but I assume that there is no negotiation between the instructor and his TAs, his or her.
So, what if this is occurring November 8th, 2016?
It's hot that day.
What if this is a critical race theory in education class? What if this is a math class?
I think it always matters.
Always matters. And some you can't anticipate. So this was my class. Surprise, surprise. And it was, I will say, early in my implementation of inclusive pedagogy. And it was a valuable learning experience. Right? That's why the intentionality wasn't there. The socially just part wasn't there. Right? Eventually, grace was there. Right? There's an article where we go into much more detail around it. It's cited below. I encourage you to seek it out. I will say in 1 quarter, that was some of my worst teaching and some of my best teaching. Right? Because I was presented with an opportunity to respond to a way in which I failed a class. So, how do I avoid doing that, creating that circumstance? Here are just some ideas. I think carefully about how diverse students are going to be arranged in groups. Very clear about setting ground rules, developing expectations for group interaction. Talk to students about their past experiences with group work. Identify and communicate the instructional objectives for why I'm choosing to mandate group work. Decide on group size. I've read somewhere that the optimal group size is 4 to 6. Assess potential barriers and identify strategies for group cohesion. So it requires some kind of understanding. The reason Shayla didn't want to be in that group is she had taken a series of classes with one individual in particular in the class. We later learned that and felt uncomfortable being in that class, in that group. Ask students to reflect on previous group experiences. A couple of things I'm still thinking about. In an article we go into detail about. So I often hear, well, why didn't you just do random? Random could have resulted in the same outcome. All random does is allow us to not have a responsibility for the outcome of the group. So there has to be some intentionality around it. And I would argue random is not the best way to do it. What I do now is I collect information about my students and I intentionally put them into groups based on that information. And I don't keep them in the same group throughout the quarter. Right, so they have opportunities to interact in different groups. And I assess how they're experiencing the group. There are 3 questions I ask my students at the end of every class. What stood out for you? What questions remain? And how can I improve your learning in this class? Collect that data at the end of every class. And it allows me to have constant sense of how they're experiencing the class. Now, my advice is if you choose to do this, make sure you use the information you get. Because the students remember, hey, I wrote this. You didn't address it. What stood out for you? What questions remain? And how can I improve your learning in this classroom? So wrapping up here, and we'll get to some Q&A. The case intentionally is vague about whether this is gender or race or both. And it's vague because we need to consider the variety of ways in which our students show up with multiple interlocking, intersecting aspects of their identity that shape who they are. And depending on the context, one aspect of their identity could be under threat today and another tomorrow or in the same class. So I'm going to talk about this in 2 ways, and then we'll just get into Q&As. In inclusive learning environments, instructors evaluate how their curriculum and pedagogies reinforce particular powers and privileges. The idea is to understand that our classrooms are not neutral spaces. The fact that it's situated on this land, in this building, matters for some folks. So even before we enter into the classroom, there are already issues of power and privilege that are going to impact the learning environment. Inclusive learning environments, instructors are motivated by classroom dialogue that honors multiple perspectives, allowing students to be validated by the sharing of their cultural experiences. I'm a firm believer that when we give students the opportunity to connect their lived experiences to the content, they are going to engage that material in so much more meaningful ways. Inclusive learning environments, instructors review curriculum for hidden forms of oppression, such as stereotyping, inaccurate generalizations, historical omissions, and make the appropriate changes. The example I gave about my hearing impaired student is just one of those. Right? We have to be prepared to and willing to adjust. And in inclusive learning environments, faculty instructors demonstrate their care for students by creating affirmingly and socially just learning environments, again, that welcome all perspectives. So this is at the classroom level and some of the things that we can do to manage the classroom. Our classrooms do not operate in isolation, floating aimlessly in space. They're connected to a larger institutional structure that has a set of ways of doing things that historically have not supported, rewarded, reinforced what we're asking you to do. And so there needs to be some shifts at the institutional level. I think if we can start from the classroom, move to the program in the department, move to the college, and eventually move to the institution, we have a chance to radically change the learning environment. But I think we have to start in spaces that we can control. Our classroom is a space, in theory, where we can control. The program in the department, the collective body of faculty have the ability to influence that, and so on. Constantly reflect on and examine the learning environment at multiple levels in the classroom, departments, division, from the perspective of inclusive pedagogy. Do what you're doing now with EPIC and other programs at the institution, facilitate opportunities for sharing. I really would encourage you to be more intentional about moving out of the humanities as a great starting place. What will happen if we don't get our colleagues across the other places? Our students will leave our classes and go into these other worlds. And either it's going to go bad for them or go bad for the instructors. So the more we can get to the institutional approach on this, the better chance we have to move the needle. Build an infrastructure and provide opportunities for the development of competencies for inclusive teaching. We have to figure out how to reward this. I was sharing earlier, we have now at the University of Denver gotten to a place where teachers can reflect on their efforts to create inclusive learning environments as a part of their annual review process. What that now means is that it's documented, it's a part of their package when they're going up for promotion, when we're considering merit. And deans have been told that this should count. Right?
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you document this?
A part of our review process, we have to write a reflection on the year. And so we talk about what we've done, both in terms of implementing and in terms of raising our awareness about these issues.
Like a personal statement?
Yeah, as a part of a personal statement. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I thought you. No. Okay. Yes.
We have that at UCLA now as well. The question is whether it actually becomes. And I'm not.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I think we'll recognize that classrooms will change, then departments will change, then colleges will change, and then institutions. But we're all playing catch up. Right? We're all playing catch up. And sometimes we're also responding to pushback, right? Which also makes that challenging. And continuously seek out opportunities to build capacity for creating inclusive learning environments that are specifically tailored for your institutional context. Context matters. I mentioned this notion of care, and I will close with this. For me, inclusive pedagogy is more than just a pedagogical approach. It is a way to meet my students where they are in the most authentic versions of themselves. It comes from a place of deep care and a deep commitment to their learning, that we have to do the hard work in order for them to have an opportunity to be the best versions of themselves. And so I end the chapter in the Critical Inclusive Pedagogies book with this quote, that making excellence inclusive in our classrooms require the construction of learning environments where, in the words of James Baldwin, everyone is embraced, where there's no oppression, where every life is valued. In this regard, creating the conditions for inclusive learning environment must be an emotional labor of love, where educators embrace all of their students as whole human beings consisting of mind, body, and soul, and create interactive, dynamic classroom environments that inspire deep, meaningful, transformational learning and an overall sense of belonging. That when we step out of our comfort zones and dare to teach in radical, critical, inclusive ways, we create powerful learning environments that follow our students throughout the rest of their lives. And so teaching is not, for me, just not a let's teach for the sake of teaching. It is something that I believe I was called to do, even though I didn't recognize it, and something that we need more and more of you to undertake in ways that that change not only who you are, but the spaces the people you touch begin to occupy. So that's my challenge to you. To continue to push your boundaries in ways that change not only the way you think about this work, but the ways in which you touch the lives of your students. So, thank you for allowing me to share some of the things I'm passionate about. We got about 15 minutes left, so I'd love to just chat, answer some questions, hear some strategies, thoughts, reflections. Yes?
So I've asked lots of different people this question. I've been asked this question. I'd love to hear what you and everyone else might have to say about this. I think in the classroom, in some ways, doing this kind of work is a little bit easier. And what I mean by that is we have a certain authority, right, that we can encourage our students to think about things, and they're there to learn. And it's a little harder to navigate this with colleagues. And I think that if we were to go around the room, everyone in this room would say, of course I'm not racist, of course I'm not misogynistic, of course I'm not ableist, right? Of course I'm not ageist. But we're all in a system, right, that where we are reproducing these very things in some ways without realizing we're doing that. And there's a certain kind of accountability that we all have to have in how we participate in that system. And you so beautifully talked about how we can do that effectively in the classroom. So I'm just wondering if you have any like strategies on how to navigate some challenging conversations with colleagues, especially those who might be resistant to the idea that they are participating unproductively in those systems, and how to engage them to join us in that, in a more, to be more critical, critically minded in the way that they are doing that kind of work, and to be open to the fact that maybe they also have more to learn and to develop.
Yeah, yeah. A couple of thoughts on that. One, in my experience, data has been really a really effective way. The challenge is getting departments to want to look at data and to then be willing to engage in trying to make sense of the data, and ultimately to think about, so how can we do something to try to adjust this? We had a inclusive excellence assessment at my institution where we had about 50% of our full-time instructors respond, so a pretty good response rate. And they all rated themselves in the sort of 90, 95 percentile in terms of how well they embraced and engaged in inclusive pedagogical practices in the classroom. And then we asked their students, and the students had a very different response. Right, so we had to make sense of, this is how you all feel about what you're doing, this is how students are experiencing what you say you are doing well. Let's try to figure that out. Let's figure out how we can close the gap. So data's been one. And it has to be data that's willing to look at units on their own sort of context. We tend to do these assessments at the institutional level, and there's some good reasons around why we don't want to sort of drill down too small, too far. But in my experience, that's become an excuse for not wanting to look directly in places that need to be looked at. So data's been one. Two, I think we draw heavily on our institutional sort of mission, the discourse at the institutional level, and are pushing our deans and our program chairs to see that there's a need to align, sort of, not just to commit and say we agree with this, but to align with, so how do the choices you're making move you closer to engaging and embracing the larger institutional mission around these efforts. we were talking earlier at lunch today about how do we get folks beyond the choir to show up at the types of events that we're doing. And I think you have to have a varied approach. We found in our experience that we took a very central approach, come to the center of teaching and learning for this session at this particular time and place. And some faculty would do that. It was often the choir. And then we said, all right, we're going to go to your units, and we're going to do individual program and department meetings. And then people started coming who we wouldn't see at the central meeting. So there was something about creating these alternative pathways to engage in the content that seemed to work. And I think part of this is fear. You don't want to show up at a large meeting, not knowing who else is going to be there. And the smaller, more intimate environments seem to work. So varying the ways of getting at faculty in my context, seem to be helpful. And then I think the third thing that we leverage was many of our programs and disciplines belong to larger bodies and associations that have, I think, got out in front, and some more than others, and saying that these are expectations we have. We've built into our program review process. Each unit is evaluated every 3 years. We now have a framework around inclusive excellence that they have to respond to, and it becomes a part of their evaluation. And this evaluation is reviewed by our Board of Trustees. So we've built it in and also made it a little more efficient in terms of our institutional research office is prepared to supply some of that data. So whether it's accreditation bodies, national associations, or our own institutional expectations, there are some accountabilities that our leaders now have to respond to say, how are you addressing these? So it has to be a variety of approaches. Those are some things. Other things that folks have heard of, experienced that seem to work.
Yeah, it's more of a comment. I'm coming from a very cross-cultural environment, and these questions of identity have always been very difficult for me because they take me back. Mm-hmm. Everyone has their own experience where, I was asked to decide, anyways. And so what I do in my classrooms is I explain where I'm coming from and my multicultural background and so on. And what I noticed is that regardless of what the topic is, I find an opportunity for people to explain their own personal experiences, to share who they are, what they're interested in, and so on. And whenever we're doing group work or whatever, I invite people to share not just their critical account of the subject matter that they have to deal with, but their personal input. In other words, I really honestly believe that when we invite our students to really get to know one another and to talk to one another, they get invested into one another and they begin to understand where they are coming from. And to me, that's the basis of any kind of understanding of one another. In other words, I'm not starting with what color are you, who are, whatever. It's a little bit more, it's thicker than that. And yeah, that's it.
So
I think it's very important to always have that as an organic part of every class.
Organic, but still intentional, right? So
very intentional, very intentional, and I believe you have to model that.
I was just going to say the important part of that is modeling it.
Yeah,
right?
Modeling that, and I've spoken to some educators and so on, and I honestly believe when you walk into the classroom, if you don't have 100% respect for every single human being that is in there, regardless of whatever, you know, if they can speak English or they're just trying, or if they can be super expressive or not, then you have no business walking into that classroom. Honestly, because that's how it starts. And, you know, I think that that's a kind of discussion where anybody can be invited into, our callings and so on, because that, you know, even those who are not interested in inclusive language per se, you know, yeah, I know.
I mean, as the diversity person in writing programs, I've had a lot of really uncomfortable situations happen, so I don't think it's quite that simple. I think that's a really great starting point and works really well in the classroom. With colleagues, it's a lot more complicated because they see themselves as experts already. They don't, whereas students are there to learn and they know they have something to learn.
Oh.
So it becomes.
But that's a relationship, you know, and you mentioned that earlier that you're a learner and a teacher. I don't see, you know, if you see yourself as an expert, 100% expert coming to a classroom where you have nothing to learn from your students, you're dead.
Yeah.
You have nothing to learn.
Unfortunately, our institutions reinforce our, and I will own this, our ability to fake as if we are experts. And so that's a challenge. I do think that we have to, that leadership matters in this. And so we have to get to a point where we are making decisions about who we invite into our community based on their openness, one, and two, their ability to go where we need them to go to create the kind of spaces. We haven't been 100% committed to that, even though we say that, even though we have diversity questions at my institution, you cannot apply for a job and avoid answering a question about diversity as a part of that, of the employment experience. But are we treating that question seriously when we ask it, or are we checking the box, right? Are we holding people accountable in the interview process, or are we making excuses for why? Well, that's not their area of expertise. This is something we can work with, right? So we need to get to a place where we're seriously committed to making sure that we have the capacity, knowledge, and skills to deliver on the values we claim to hold. And I think the reason our environments are where they are right now is because we don't have those three across the board. We have them in some places, and there are pockets of excellence where we're doing that. But by and large, across the board, we don't have the capacity to deliver on our promise, unfortunately. We are at time. And I feel like we just got started to the good stuff. Thank you all.
Thank you.